The Cataclysm didn't just change the world, it ended the one that came before it. Abyssal rifts tore open across every continent simultaneously, the sky cracking apart like glass as the system integration forcibly merged with reality. Monsters flooded out of the eternal abyss in numbers that defied comprehension, and humanity learned the hardest possible lesson in the shortest possible time. Awaken your talent, change your job, grow stronger, or be consumed. Entire cities vanished overnight. Nations that had stood for centuries dissolved in weeks. The old world, with all its comfort and certainty, was gone, and what replaced it was something far more brutal and far more alive. 300 years of dungeons, abyssal spawn, and the relentless climb toward power later. A being that calls itself God emerges from the depths of the eternal abyss and declares the extinction of mankind as though it were already decided. It has clearly never met Nova Stern. On the day of his awakening, Nova receives a talent that earns little more than a passing glance from the examiners. Unlimited amplification, unranked, undescribed, unremarkable on paper. What nobody understands yet is that there is no upper limit to what it can touch, and no version of strength it cannot multiply into something terrifying. Comprehension amplified 100,000x SSS rank talent. Absolute insight acquired. Basic breathing method analyzed. Primordial breathing method forged. Cultivation speed. X1,000. Physical body amplified 10,000x Immortal physique achieved. Nuclear resistant. Origin talent amplified 1,000,000x apex origin. Eternal flame awakened. Abyssal lords, ancient monsters, and a self-proclaimed god with the nerve to threaten the entire human race. They are all about to learn what it means to stand in the path of something that has no ceiling, no limit, and no intention of stopping. A god walked out of the abyss and announced the end of the world. Nova just wants to know one thing. Do you dare take the flick of his finger? Chapter 6. Low profile. The killing intent hit. It wasn't loud or announced. 3 separate points across the field's perimeter. Each one a cold, precise spike of murderous focus that absolute insight flagged before Nova's conscious mind had finished registering what he was sensing. 3 of the instructors stationed at the array's edge, bodies shifting with the specific microtension of people who had committed to an action and were now executing it. One was already moving toward a female teacher standing beside him, hand drawn back into a blade strike aimed at her spine. One had both hands raised, forming something in the air between them. A barrier taking shape, its geometry designed to trap rather than defend. One was gathering lightning between his palms, eyes fixed on the cluster of elite-class students, the charge building fast. Nova had time to register all 3 threat vectors, calculate the probable outcomes, and determine that he had absolutely no need to intervene, not that he could. But because Gareth Ironvale had already seen it. The headmaster didn't move or speak. He didn't visibly do anything at all, and yet all 3 instructors stopped simultaneously, locked in place as completely as statues, their bodies suspended mid-motion by something that had no visible form. The one whose hand had been centimeters from the female teacher's spine hung frozen with his strike half delivered. The barrier specialist's formation collapsed unfinished. The lightning died in the third man's palms before it could discharge. Then they were yanked. All 3, at speed, dragged across the field through the air toward where Gareth stood, their bodies offering no resistance because resistance wasn't an option. They arrived before him like things reeled in on a line and hung there, unable to move, unable to speak, staring at a man who was looking at them the way a person looks at something faintly disappointing. "Did you really think," Gareth said quietly, "that you could accomplish anything standing in front of me? Do you think Tier 7 is a joke?" The mockery in his voice was almost gentle. For 1 second, something shifted in all 3 faces simultaneously, calculation replaced by resolution. They weren't going to be captured and weren't willing to be tortured and be interrogated. They realized his assassination attempt had failed. Rather than retreat, their expression twisted into fanatical fervor. For the eternal abyss, Nova felt it a half-beat before it happened. The particular stillness of people who had decided. All 3 Tier 6 cultivators detonated their cores at once. The energy that erupted from 3 Tier 6 self-destructions simultaneously was not something with a clean comparison. A nuclear detonation was a single spark of light held next to it. The combined force could level a continent. Not metaphorically, not with sustained effort, but immediately in the first second of release. It was the kind of energy that rewrote geography. But Gareth wasn't going to let that happen. He muttered to himself, time to show off. Gareth raised one hand. The expected explosion that everyone was already shielding their body from didn't happen. What existed instead was a sphere, less than a meter across, hovering in the air directly in front of the headmaster's extended palm, containing all of it. Every joule of continent-ending force, compressed into a space smaller than a dining table, held there with the casual steadiness of a man holding a lantern. There was no shockwave, heat, or even a sound beyond a faint, deep hum that resonated in the chest rather than the ears. The entire field had gone absolutely silent. Nova looked at the sphere. Even at this distance, even suppressed into that tiny space, the energy inside it was perceptible. A pressure against the awareness, a wrongness in the air around it that every person present could feel without understanding why. The students who were closest had gone pale. A few had stepped back without deciding to. Even Aldrich Wintercrown, who had spent his entire life being told he was exceptional, was staring at that sphere with an expression he probably didn't know was on his face. This was what Tier 7 meant. Not the numbers or the battle power figures in a textbook. This, a man holding a continent's destruction in one hand and looking mildly inconvenienced by the attempt. And the inconvenience was probably from the disturbance and media commotion this situation will cause. Gareth closed his fist. The sphere vanished. The hum stopped. The air normalized in an instant, as though it had never been disturbed. Abyss cultists, he said flatly, to no one in particular. He turned away. Clean this up. The instructors and Warrior Association representatives moved immediately, the ones still standing converging on the empty space where the 3 attackers had been. The female teacher who had nearly been killed was already being supported, pale but breathing. She was already stabilized from the shock of a near-death crisis. Cade let out a long, shaky breath beside Nova. I've heard the rumors about S-rank awakeners being targeted by assassins from the Abyss cult. Guess today confirmed them. Nova said nothing. He was still processing, not the attack itself but the implications sitting underneath it. S-rank awakeners drew Tier 6 cultist assassination teams. Cultivators willing to self-detonate just to remove a potential future threat. And that was for S-rank. He thought about what his panel currently said. The mythical profession. The 3 talents. The 67,000 battle power at level 0. The gray soul that suggested whatever he truly was hadn't even begun to surface yet. If any of that became known, the people coming for him wouldn't be Tier 6. And they wouldn't stop at him. His father on the border. Aunt Mira. His cousin in her first academy year. The decision didn't require deliberation. It was simply obvious. Stay invisible. Keep everything buried. Let the world think what it wanted to think. Cade was watching him. So, what did you awaken? Nova let a breath out through his nose. Arranged his expression into something that carried just the right weight of resigned acceptance. E-rank talent, he said. Job awakened as Shadow Reaper. Cade stared at him. The sympathy that moved across his face was genuine and immediate, the specific kind that came from a person who actually cared. He put a hand on Nova's shoulder. Man, I'm sorry. I thought for sure you'd pull at least B rank with your training discipline. It is what it is. You've still got the Shadow Reaper profession though, that's not nothing. Assassination class, solid damage output. Cade, right? Processing time. Got it. He paused for exactly 2 seconds. For what it's worth, with your face you could absolutely make bank as a professional model for academy recruitment posters. That's not what you were going to say. It absolutely was. Cade's grin surfaced briefly, doing the work it was meant to do. Come on. They're moving us back to the classrooms. The field cleared in waves as instructors herded students back toward the academy buildings. The injured were routed to the infirmary. The handful of S-rank awakeners, Aldrich and the other elite class standouts, were separated and escorted toward the headmaster's office for secondary verification, their results requiring official confirmation before formal registration. Everyone else filed back through the corridors to their respective classrooms. Class 3 settled into their seats with the specific energy of people who had been through something significant and were now being asked to sit still and fill out forms about it. Instructor Mordain stood at the podium with her roster, her expression carrying its standard professional remove, and began working through the list. Seraphine Vex. A rank origin talent. Profession. Shadow Mage. The murmur that moved through the room was impressed and unsurprised in equal measure. Seraphine accepted it with a small nod and returned her eyes to her desk. Garrett Steelheart. A rank origin talent. Profession. Spear Master. Marcus Ironwood. B rank origin talent. Profession. Guardian. Cade Fenrir. C rank origin talent. Profession. Monster Veterinarian. Cade received this with philosophical resignation. Valor Nova Stern. E-rank origin talent. Profession. Shadow Reaper. The reaction was immediate and unsubtle. Several female students who had spent the better part of 3 years finding reasons to sit near him, or borrowing notes they didn't need, or laughing slightly too readily at things that weren't that funny, turned to look at him with expressions that moved visibly through surprise, disappointment, and a rapid recalibration of interest. One of them had the grace to look embarrassed about the recalibration. Most didn't bother. The boys who had awakened D-rank and E-rank talents themselves discovered a sudden, comfortable solidarity. "At least I'm not that guy," someone muttered, in the specific tone of a person who had been that guy 5 minutes ago and was grateful for the reassignment. Nova looked at his desk. He was unbothered in the way that only came from genuinely not caring, not performing indifference, not suppressing a reaction, simply finding that no reaction was available because the opinions of people this far beneath his actual reality didn't produce one. Mordain finished the roll and set down her clipboard. "Before we proceed to measurements," she said, "I want to address something you will all be doing every day from this point forward without exception." She held up a thin booklet, the Basic Spirit Refining Technique Standard Issue, handed to every graduating class on ceremony day. "Spirit Cultivation. Begin it tonight. Do not skip days." She let that land before continuing. "Spirit is not the most visible attribute on your panel. It doesn't make your punches hit harder in any direct way. What it does is determine everything else: your comprehension speed, your battle instinct, your soul power, your capacity to understand and apply techniques at a deeper level. It is the single attribute most directly tied to your long-term ceiling as a warrior. Every other attribute can be trained up through effort. Spirit grows differently, through refining, through comprehension, through consistent daily practice that accumulates over years." She paused. "The basic spirit refining technique is, despite its name, not easy. It is more technically demanding than most advanced martial techniques you will encounter in your first 2 tiers of cultivation. It requires genuine focus and mental precision. Students who treat it as a secondary task and practice it carelessly will see minimal gains. Students who apply themselves seriously will compound those gains across their entire cultivation career. A normal spirit attribute of a student who just awakens sits around 20. Exceptional students reach 25 and genius reach 30 and above. Those numbers matter enormously when it comes to combat university applications and warrior registration assessments. Spirit measurement begins now. Fiona Sterling, you're first." Nova watched the measurements proceed with quiet attention. The device was a flat crystalline panel set on Mordain's desk. You pressed your palm to it, and it read the spirit attribute directly. Simple, passive, accurate. No way to fake a high reading. Several ways, however, to suppress one if you had the control for it. Nova had been thinking about this since the roll call. 670 spirit. On a scale where 25 was exceptional tier. The number appearing on that panel would not produce a manageable reaction. It would produce Mordain immediately pulling him aside, followed by paperwork, followed by people asking questions he had no safe answers for, followed, eventually, by the wrong kind of attention from the wrong kind of people, for example, the Abyss cult. He spent the minutes before his name was called doing something absolute insight made considerably easier than it should have been, identifying the exact mechanism by which his spirit power projected outward, finding the boundary of it and gently, precisely pulling it inward. Not blocking the measurement, suppressing the output, like turning down a volume dial rather than cutting the power. He aimed for something plausible, respectable enough that it fit his training record, unremarkable enough that it didn't invite scrutiny. Nova stern. He walked to the front, pressed his palm to the panel. The crystal glowed briefly. 25.1. Mordain looked at the number. Something in her expression shifted, not dramatically, but the way a teacher's face shifts when a student they'd half written off produces something worth reconsidering. 25.1, she said, recording it. That places you in the top upper range for this class. Above average by a meaningful margin. A few heads turned. The recalibration from earlier became slightly more complicated for some people. Your spirit growth is consistent with your physical conditioning record, Mordain continued, studying him with an appraiser's eye. Whatever your origin talent rank, a spirit value at this level means your comprehension potential and battle instinct are solid. That matters. You may even have the chance to comprehend your talent to a deeper level, thereby enhancing its grade. Nova nodded once. Thank you, instructor. He turned to walk back to his seat. One more thing. Mordain's voice was measured but not unkind. An E-rank talent is a difficult result to build from. I won't pretend otherwise, but your spirit value and your conditioning suggest that if you push your overall metrics to the right threshold, a second-tier combat university isn't out of the question. Don't give up on that. Before Nova could respond, a sound cut through the room. A short, deliberate snort. Him. Every head turned. Darius Thornwell sat in the middle rows, yellow-dyed hair, arms folded behind his head, radiating the specific energy of someone who had been looking for an opening and found one. He looked at Nova with the kind of contempt that came from a place of genuine smallness trying to make itself taller. E-rank garbage getting into a combat university? He let the words sit in the air. Keep dreaming. Cade's hand dropped below his desk. His middle finger rose with quiet dignity. Nova looked at Darius for exactly 1 second, found nothing there worth acknowledging, and continued walking back to his seat. Darius watched him walk away and found that more irritating than a reaction would have been. What? He said to the room louder. I'm just being honest. No respectable university takes E-rank. Everyone in this room knows it. Nova sat down, opened his notebook, said nothing. The yellow-haired student stared at the back of his head. His voice dropped into something with a deliberate edge now, not performing for the room anymore, but aimed. Spirit value 25% points though. Impressive for bottom-tier trash. A pause. What happened? Did your useless soldier father finally die on the border, using his death pension to buy some spirit treasures on the black market? The classroom went quiet all at once. Not the quiet of people ignoring something. The quiet of people who had just watched something cross a line and were holding still to see what happened next. Nova stopped writing. He set his pen down. Slowly, the motion completely controlled. He turned his head and looked at Darius Thornwell. Not with anger, not with heat, but with something considerably quieter and considerably more dangerous than either. The kind of look that didn't need volume because it wasn't performing anything. It was simply there and it was absolute. What? He said, each word arriving separately and precisely. Did you just say? Chapter 7. Garbage. Confronted by Nova's cold stare, Darius felt something he hadn't expected. A flutter of panic that arrived before any conscious thought did. An instinctive sense of danger crawled up his spine without giving him a reason, which his unrational mind immediately rejected. He was looking at an E-rank student from an ordinary family who barely reached his shoulder. There was no logical basis for what his instincts were telling him, which made him considerably angrier than he'd been a moment ago. He shoved his desk aside with a screech of metal on floor and stood, using every centimeter of his height advantage to look down at Nova. What if I say it again? His voice came out harder than he intended, compensating. You're worthless. Trash. Cade was on his feet before the second word landed. Darius, you son of a... Sit down, Fenrir. You yourself are also a piece of trash. The voice that cut through next was not Cade's. Seraphine Vex stepped up onto her chair with the unhurried certainty of someone who had already made a decision and was simply executing it. She rolled her uniform sleeves up to the elbow, her delicate features arranged into an expression of pure, unambiguous aggression. "What are you barking about, you mangy cur?" Her voice carried across the entire classroom without effort. "You awakened B rank and now you think the world belongs to you? Let's go to the practice arena and find out how special you really are." The murmur that moved through the room was immediate. Nobody had expected Seraphine, who had just awakened a rare-tier profession and had more reason than anyone to simply ignore this, to step in publicly. Nova glanced at her briefly. She had always been territorial about her desk space. This was something different. Darius's bravado lost a fraction of its certainty. He looked at Seraphine, did the calculation honestly, and arrived at the only sensible conclusion. "Fight you? I concede. I'm not interested in getting humiliated." "Coward!" Seraphine's eyes flashed. "Then apologize to Nova." Darius's gaze slid back across the room. "I respect people who are stronger than me. I won't apologize to garbage." The flush that crossed Seraphine's face was genuine. "What did you just—" "I believe in one thing." Darius raised one arm and flexed slowly, letting the muscle speak for itself. He was looking at Nova now, and his grin had returned with its full complement of teeth. "Strength. Everything in this era is decided by force. If he can beat me, I'll do more than apologize. I'll kneel, kowtow, and call him daddy." He spread his gaze across the classroom with deliberate arrogance. "The question is whether he has the strength. And in my opinion, aside from Seraphine and Garrett, everyone else sitting in this room is garbage." Roland lurched upright from the middle rows. "Darius, you piece of—" Darius turned his smile toward the larger boy with patient expectation. Roland looked at the knuckles already whitening on Darius's raised fist, did his own calculation, and sat back down without finishing the sentence. "My blood and chi value exceeded 25.4 at this morning's measurement," Darius continued, pacing now, working the room with the energy of someone who had never had an audience refuse him before. "I've awakened B rank. A first-tier combat university is a formality for me. Meanwhile, even if every single one of you dedicates your entire life to training, you might maybe scrape into a second-tier school. Once I'm in university, the resources available to me will be on a completely different level. The gap between us won't just widen. It'll become something you can't see across." He paused in front of Nova's desk and spread his arms in mock generosity. "So if any of you want to challenge me, do it now. In another month, you won't qualify to breathe the same air." Anger moved through the classroom like a current with nowhere to discharge. The students who felt it most sat the stillest, because Darius's words were cruel and delivered with theatrical satisfaction. But they weren't wrong. In a world where talent determined the trajectory of a life, where a single awakening result could separate two people who had trained with equal discipline into entirely different futures, personal effort often meant very little against the simple fact of a higher rank. Instructor Mordain observed from the front of the room and did not intervene. She had learned over many years of teaching that moments like this one, uncomfortable, charged, sitting on the edge of something, revealed more about a student's character than any assessment she could design. The Academy's philosophy was not incidental. In an era where abyssal spawn could level continents or even the whole planet if left unchecked, and warriors were what stood between humanity and extinction, controlled aggression and the drive to prove oneself were not qualities to extinguish in a classroom. They were qualities to measure. She would step in if a line was crossed. Until then, she watched and noted. Darius leaned forward, dropping his voice to something more pointed. "Look at you, hiding behind women. You train harder than anyone in this class. I'll give you that. Every morning, every evening, I've seen you at it. But effort without talent is just exhausting yourself on the way to the same result." He tilted his head. "If I train 2 hours a day and take a few supplements, I'll pass you without trying. My talent crushes yours completely. Doesn't that make you angry?" Nova met his gaze without expression and then looked past him toward the front of the room. "Instructor Mordain," he said clearly, "I formally request access to a trial combat chamber." Mordain paused with her pen above her clipboard. Seraphine whipped around to stare at him. Cade grabbed his arm with both hands. Nova, stop. Think about this for a second. Darius cracked his knuckles slowly, one by one, his grin widening back to its full extent. Well, you've got nerve, I'll give you that. If I don't put you on your knees today, I'll consider it a personal failure. We all know my guy is about to eat shit. Nova was not thinking impulsively. He had already worked through the calculation twice in the seconds since Darius had made the comment about his father, and he had arrived at the same answer both times. He had initially decided to stay invisible and lay low. He intended to honor that decision across almost every situation he would encounter. But an insult aimed at his father, a man who spent every year stationed at a wall between the city and monsters that could level continents, doing honest, dangerous work for modest pay without complaint, was not a situation he was willing to absorb quietly. There was staying low and there was accepting something that shouldn't be accepted. Those were different things. The second reason was more practical. If he walked away from this without responding, he would become a target. Every person in this building who was looking for someone to look down on would read his silence as an open invitation. He had chosen invisibility, not the role of a doormat, and maintaining the first required making certain the second never took root. He shook his head slightly at Cade, who released his arm with the expression of a person who had tried. Mordain studied Nova's face for a moment and found what she was looking for. Not rage, not wounded pride, but a quiet, settled certainty that had already made its decision and was simply waiting for the formality to conclude. She couldn't refuse. The regulations were clear, and she had seen enough of his expression to know the conversation was over. She tapped her watch interface and invoked instructor-level authority. The classroom shuddered. The walls expanded outward with smooth mechanical precision, desks and chairs retracting into recessed floor panels in a sequence that took less than 10 seconds. The ordinary teaching space finished its transformation into a combat chamber with gleaming metallic surfaces and impact-resistant fixtures, the overhead lighting shifting to the flat, even illumination used for assessment. Unarmed combat, Mordain said, her voice carrying the weight of official judgment. 10-minute limit. Darius strode to the center of the chamber, rolling his shoulders, not bothering to adopt any formal stance. He extended his right hand and made a slow, beckoning gesture, his expression sitting comfortably in the vicinity of contempt. Come on then. Can't say I didn't give you a chance. Nova crossed the chamber. Or rather, he was at one end of the chamber, and then he was directly in front of Darius, and the space between those two facts contained nothing that anyone present could account for. His fist was already in motion when he arrived, stopping with his knuckles a precise distance from Darius's face, close enough that the displaced air moved the yellow-dyed hair. The chamber went completely silent. Darius had not moved, not because he had chosen not to, because he had not perceived anything to react to until it was already finished. Cold sweat appeared across his forehead with sudden totality. Did anyone actually see that? Someone said from the edge of the room, in the specific tone of a person checking whether their eyes were functioning. What just happened? He's supposed to be E-rank. What's wrong? Nova's voice carried a coldness that had nothing performative in it. You had quite a lot to say a moment ago. Is this all you've got? The humiliation hit Darius in a wave and came back out as rage. His face went from white to red in approximately 1 second. I was caught off guard. That's all. Now I'm taking this seriously. He stepped forward and threw a haymaker at Nova's face with the full commitment of someone who had decided that overwhelming force was the answer to whatever had just confused him. Mordain watched the initial confrontation from the boundary of the chamber and felt something shift in her understanding of the situation. Nova's body responded to the incoming strike with a precision that had nothing to do with instinct and everything to do with mastery. His weight redistributed across his stance in a way that was almost invisible, a fraction of movement that changed every angle simultaneously. And then his blood and chi moved. She could see it, as someone who had cultivated long enough to read the energy signatures of those around her. His blood and chi, the natural energy of the body, condensed through cultivation into an ethereal and powerful force that every warrior learned to harness for strength enhancement, attack amplification, and movement techniques. was circulating through his martial pathways with a fluency that stopped her internal monologue entirely. The vibrational force technique. She recognized it from the textbooks. A martial technique that used blood and chi to generate rapid oscillating force at the point of contact, dispersing incoming energy rather than absorbing it. A technique that required a level of internal control most students spent years working toward. Nova applied it to Darius's incoming fist as though the movement cost him nothing, redirecting the kinetic force and leaving Darius's strike with nowhere to go. Then his right hand opened into a palm, clamped onto Darius's face, and pulled. Darius left his feet. The floor arrived. The impact echoed through the chamber. Darius lay on his back staring at the ceiling with the expression of someone whose model of reality had just been revised without their consent. Mordaine's mind was still moving through what she had just observed, and the further it moved, the less comfortable the destination became. That was not minor proficiency in the basic martial arts. Minor proficiency produced technique amplification of perhaps 5 to 10% above baseline, useful, respectable, exactly what she expected from the top students in a graduating class. What she had just seen was something categorically different. The economy of movement, the internal energy control, the way his blood and chi had responded to his intent without any visible transition between decision and execution. That was perfect mastery. She was certain of it, as she too had perfect mastery of vibrational force technique. And if she was reading the underlying signature correctly, it might have been something above that. She had been teaching for 11 years. She had never seen a student achieve perfect mastery of the basic martial arts before entering university, let alone just after their job awakening. Why had he never shown this? In 3 years of practical assessments, his scores had been high but not extraordinary. He had been careful, she realized. He had been deliberately careful every single time. Why would a student with that level of mastery choose to conceal it? Oh, I get it now, he was probably cautious because of assassinations. And after what happened today at the awakening ceremony, I hope he will be more cautious. Looks like I would have to have a talk with him later. You're just weak, Nova said, looking down at Darius with a flatness that made the words land harder than shouting would have. I thought a B-rank talent would mean something. You're disappointingly fragile. He paused. Garbage. The word arrived with surgical precision. Darius processed it for approximately 2 seconds before something behind his eyes snapped. He scrambled upright, and as he came to his feet, the yellowish substance began spreading across his skin, coating it, hardening, thickening into the armor-like plating that his B-rank defensive talent produced when fully activated. I'll kill you. The words came out of a face contorted well past the point of strategy. It's his talent. Someone in the crowd shouted immediately. It's over. Shadow Reaper is an assassination class, not a tank. There is no way he breaks through B-rank defense with his stats. Nova's leg moved. The kick came with a sound like displaced air under genuine pressure, fast, precise, and aimed at a specific point in the defensive coverage that Mordaine's trained eye recognized immediately as the one geometrically weakest position in that particular talent's protection pattern. The angle, the velocity, the exact targeting, all of it was correct in a way that required either extraordinary instinct or extraordinary comprehension of how the talent's defensive structure actually worked. The yellowish armor shattered. It didn't crack or bend. It shattered, fragmenting outward in pieces, and the force that had shattered it continued through to Darius underneath and launched him backward with the complete commitment of kinetic energy that had found nothing left to slow it down. Darius hit the back wall of the chamber and left a crater in the reinforced surface. He slid down it, leaving a smear, and came to rest at the base with his eyes rolled back and his body making no further decisions for the foreseeable future. The student who had declared it was overstood with their jaw in the open position, producing no sound. Complete silence held the chamber for several seconds. Then it broke all at once. 2 moves. Someone's voice was not entirely steady. He beat Darius in 2 moves and he's supposed to be E-rank. Someone explain what I just watched. Is anyone else questioning their entire understanding of the talent ranking system right now? Cade was standing with both hands on top of his head, fingers pressed into his scalp, staring at Nova with the expression of a person whose 3 years of accumulated observations had just been rendered insufficient. When, he said, to no one in particular, Did this happen? When did he become, what is, how? Seraphine was watching Nova from across the chamber with an expression that was not quite surprise. It was something more considered than that, the look of someone whose existing theory had just been confirmed rather than overturned, though the confirmation had come in a form larger than anticipated. And she definitely knows something. At the front of the chamber, Instructor Mordain stood with her clipboard at her side and studied Nova stern with the full attention of someone who had realized, several seconds too late, that she had significantly miscalculated what she was dealing with. He met her gaze with complete calm, his dark eyes giving away nothing at all. And for just a fraction of a second, there and gone before she could be certain, she thought she saw something in them. Faint shimmer, colors that didn't belong. Rainbow light, flickering once and then gone. Chapter 8. Creating the impossible. The combat chamber was still frozen in silence when Nova turned away from Darius's crumpled form without sparing it a glance. He walked to the front of the room and looked at Instructor Mordain with complete composure. Instructor, the martial aptitude examination is approaching. I'd like to request leave to train independently at home. Mordain blinked, still working through what she had just watched. Yes. Approved. Nova nodded once and walked out. The door sealed behind him and the classroom detonated. What just happened? He's supposed to be E-rank. How is he that strong? Did he take enhancement drugs or something? Are you serious? His family can barely afford basic supplements. Then explain what we saw. His talent and blood and chi values are both worse than Darius's, and he demolished him in 2 moves. That makes absolutely no sense. Several heads turned toward Cade simultaneously, with the unified logic of people who had identified the most obvious source of answers. You're his best friend. You have to know something. Cade spread both hands wide, his expression the picture of genuine bewilderment. I genuinely have nothing. This is news to me too. That answer satisfied nobody, which was unfortunate, because it was completely true. The sky rail ran its usual route through the afternoon city, the steel towers of Thornhaven sliding past the window at a height that made everything below look manageable. Nova sat with his back against the seat and watched the city move and felt, for the first time since arriving in this world, something he hadn't expected. The weight was lifting, not dramatically or all at once. Just a quiet, incremental release of something that had been pressing down for 17 years, the specific pressure of existing in a world where power determined everything while having none of it. He had trained every day because it was the only lever available to him. He had been careful, disciplined, patient because patience was what the situation required. The situation had changed somewhat. Primordial origin talent, mythical tier profession, divine tier comprehension, a physique that was no longer entirely human, a soul that was ancient in ways he hadn't begun to understand, battle power that placed him in Tier 3 territory before he had reached Level 1. It still sat slightly sideways against the texture of an ordinary afternoon commute, the city doing its usual city things outside the window, 2 students nearby arguing about lunch options with complete dedication. His watch vibrated. Incoming message, Naya, Nix announced cheerfully from the display. Nova tapped the interface. His father's name appeared. Thornstern. Son, hope the academy hasn't been too rough lately. How did the job awakening ceremony go? Nova read it twice. The casual phrasing was doing a lot of work to contain the anxiety underneath it. His father had probably been checking his device since morning, trying to appear patient. He thought briefly about what the honest answer looked like. E-rank was a preliminary result before my soul detonated the crystal and gave me a primordial origin talent, after which I job awakened into a mythical tier profession that doesn't exist in any textbook, completed a 10-floor nightmare trial against Tier 2 versions of myself, and currently have battle power that would concern most Tier 3 warriors. His father was stationed at a border wall dealing with abyssal spawn. He didn't need that. Nova composed his reply. Nova E-rank origin talent. Job awakened as Shadow Reaper. Several minutes passed. He watched the city. Thornstern. E-rank isn't ideal, but don't let it get to you. A warrior's real strength isn't determined by talent classification alone. The examination is coming. Use this last month to refine your physique and sharpen your techniques. I received my salary today and transferred some funds to your account. Use it for quality beast meat. You're at a growth stage where your body needs proper fuel. Don't hesitate to spend it. If you need more, just ask. Nova read it once and set the watch face down on his knee for a moment. His father earned a modest salary doing work that put him between a city and things that could level continents, and his first response to his son's disappointing awakening result was to transfer money for supplements and tell him not to worry. He picked the watch back up. Nova, understood. Thank you, Dad. Stay safe. Thorn stern. Of course. Your old man's tougher than he looks. 2. Zunova looked at the Awaken for a moment. His father had clearly been spending time with the younger soldiers at the garrison again. He made a mental note to send him something useful about Awaken usage before the habit progressed further. The apartment was quiet when he arrived since he left school early. Aunt Myra's shift ran late. His cousin Lina would be at the academy for another few hours. He had the place to himself, which was exactly what he needed. He locked his bedroom door, settled cross-legged on his bed, and opened the panel he'd been carrying in the back of his awareness since the trial spire ended its celebration effects. The Supreme Treasure Chest. Supreme Treasure Chest. Opening. Reward obtained. Active skill. Analyze. Before he could examine the description, a second notification appeared immediately beneath it. System notice. Active skill. Analyze is redundant with existing divine tier talent. Absolute insight. Analyze will be merged into Absolute Insight. All identification and analysis functions now operate through Absolute Insight with no cooldown restriction and enhanced depth. Nova absorbed that without surprise. It made sense. Absolute Insight already processed information at a level that made a 10-minute cooldown identification skill look like a candle next to a fusion reactor. Reward obtained. Sovereign Spiral Blade. Legendary tier. The weapon materialized in his palm, and he looked at it properly for the first time. Sovereign Spiral Blade, legendary tier. It was a throwing blade. Not the simple circular kind, but something more deliberate and aggressive in its construction. The main body was silver with a mechanical, geometric structure, its surface divided into angular panels that interlocked with precision engineering. From both sides of that central body, large red blade edges swept outward in sharp asymmetric curves, each one ground to an edge that caught light like a warning. The whole weapon was built to spin. The geometry of its design made that obvious, every curve and angle calculated to maximize rotational stability and cutting surface during flight. 30 of them, each one spirit-threaded, waiting for his intent to direct them. Nova turned one over in his hand and felt the spirit channels respond immediately to his passive output. This was exactly right. He thought about what the weapon could do in the hands of someone with a spirit stat at his level. The 30 blades could rotate simultaneously as a defensive sphere, collapse into concentrated drill formations for penetrating attacks, scatter into independent tracking projectiles, or recombine in any configuration his mind could construct quickly enough to direct. Spirit-controlled weapons had a ceiling determined entirely by the user's spirit power and imagination, and his spirit power at this tier was genuinely unreasonable. He was going to enjoy this very much. Reward obtained. Jian of the Void, Supreme tier. The Jian arrived with the specific quiet of things that were confident in their own quality. A modern long Jian, clean lines, no ornamentation, the blade carrying a faint spatial pressure that didn't announce itself but was simply present the way gravity was present. Nova held it and felt the edge of something dimensional in its construction. Not showy, not eager to demonstrate, just exceptionally, deeply good at what it was. He transferred both weapons to his system inventory. He would practice later. Reward obtained. Contracted Spirit Beast Egg. Legendary tier. The egg was warm in his palm, faintly luminescent, roughly the size of both his fists together. The system description was straightforward. Upon hatching, a spirit beast permanently soul-bonded to the contractor, its power scaling automatically with his advancement. Current incubation period, 50 days. He read the care requirement twice. 1 drop of contractor's blood fed to the egg every week until hatching. He filed it as a weekly task, pressed his thumb to his palm until a small bead of blood formed, and touched it to the egg's surface. The luminescence brightened briefly, warmly, and then settled back to its resting glow. He transferred the egg to his system inventory where it would sit safely and wait. He didn't begin cultivation immediately. Instead, he sat with something he'd been putting off since the trial ended. The memories. When absolute insight had etched during the trial and cleared 1% of the gray seal, a flood had come through that he'd suppressed instinctively because the trial didn't allow for processing time. He had sealed it behind an internal wall and left it there. Now, with the apartment quiet and no immediate demands on his attention, he eased that wall open slightly and let a controlled amount through. What arrived was not sequential or coherent. It came in fragments, images without full context, sensations attached to no specific narrative. A body he didn't recognize moving through a technique he understood perfectly, the mechanics of it bypassing his conscious mind and landing directly in his muscle memory as though he had drilled it 10,000 times. The pressure of standing in front of something that radiated God-level force, the feeling not of fear but of assessment. Measuring distance, measuring angles, deciding. A flash of dimensional space, the walls between realms visible as structures rather than abstractions, and the knowledge of how to apply force to those structures. Intense arrived with the images. Compressed, crystallized understandings of principles. Not the full law but the shape of it, the direction it pointed. The kind of thing that took ordinary cultivators years of dedicated comprehension to approach, arriving as fragments from lives that had apparently already done that work. He pushed further and his head immediately objected. A pressure behind his eyes that built quickly into something insistent. He stopped, sealed the wall again, and sat with the headache until it eased. 1%. That was what 1% of a cleared gray soul delivered, and he hadn't even absorbed 1/100th of it. He was not going to be careless about the rest. But what he had received was enough for tonight's purpose. The fragments had given him angles. Specific points where the principles underlying cultivation touched something deeper than the basic techniques represented. Places where the foundational methods reached toward a truth they couldn't quite access with their current construction. He knew how to build from those points now. He settled back against the wall, let his eyes shift to their rainbow state, and activated absolute insight. Ding! Absolute insight activated, analyzing body forging and breathing method principles. The mountain stone body forging method advanced to minor mastery in 40 seconds. Major mastery followed in another 2 minutes. Perfect mastery arrived before the 5-minute mark, and absolute insight was already moving past it before the notification finished displaying. Pulling apart the foundational principles underneath the technique's surface structure and examining what they were actually pointing at. The flowing stream breathing method followed the same arc, slightly faster because the chi cultivation principles overlapped with what he'd already processed. Then his mind went deeper. He took the compressed insights from the cleared memories, the fragments of technique, the directional hints of law, the crystallized understanding from lives of combat, and began connecting them to the principles absolute insight had just fully mapped. A point where the body-forging method's approach to physical densification touched something the memory fragments had already resolved. An angle on chi circulation that the breathing method approached from one direction while a fragmented intent from a past life approached from another. And the intersection of those two approaches opened a third path that neither technique had reached alone. He built along those intersections. Absolute insight processed continuously, generating and discarding frameworks at a speed that his conscious mind tracked as a sustained sense of forward motion rather than individual steps. The technique took shape gradually, each principle tested against the others, the whole structure checked for internal consistency at every stage. 6 hours and 11 minutes after he started. The construction completed. Analysis complete. Mountain stone body forging method and flowing stream breathing method fully synthesized. Fragmented cultivation insights integrated, SSS grade. Supreme rank body forging method created. Immortal Titan foundation. Nova surfaced from the session the way something surfaces from deep water slowly, with the specific heaviness of a body that had been very still for a very long time. The rainbow faded from his eyes as absolute insight deactivated. And the exhaustion that had been held at bay by the session's momentum arrived all at once. He understood the mechanism now that he could feel it directly. Absolute insight consumed spirit power to operate. A continuous draw that was manageable in short bursts but accumulated over hours into genuine depletion. His spirit stat was enormous relative to his tier, which was the only reason he had sustained 6 hours of continuous operation without shutting down earlier. But even his reserves had a floor, and he had found it. He thought, distantly and with genuine longing, about what it would feel like to have enough spirit power that absolute insight ran continuously without cost. Not a session-by-session tool, but a permanent state. Every moment of every day processed at that level of clarity. Every interaction and environment and technique fully analyzed in real time without him having to decide when to turn it on. He had no idea how much spirit power that would require. Probably an amount that would make his current stat look like a rounding error. Something to work toward. His eyes closed before he finished the thought and didn't open again. Aunt Mira came through the front door late, shoulders carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent 12 hours on her feet, dealing with other people's emergencies. She set her grocery bags on the kitchen counter and looked around the quiet apartment. "I'm home." The words came out slightly rougher than intended. The hospital was completely overwhelmed today. "Valor? You here?" The hallway answered with silence. She walked down it quietly and eased his door open just enough to look inside. He was sprawled across the bed fully clothed, both feet still on the floor from where he'd apparently sat down and simply stopped. His face was calm in a way that only genuine exhaustion produced. She looked at him for a moment, then closed the door without a sound. In the kitchen, she tied her apron and began cooking. The front door opened again about an hour later. "We're back." Lina's voice arrived at full volume before the rest of her did. High ponytail, academy uniform, the uncontainable energy of someone who had been waiting all day to ask a specific question. "Mom, is Nova home? How did the ceremony go? What did he awaken?" "Shoo." Mira pointed at the hallway. "He's asleep. Pushed himself too hard again. Ask him tomorrow." Lina deflated, but nodded and dropped her voice to a loud whisper. "Do you think he awakened something good?" Mira considered the question while stirring the pot. "Whatever he awakened, we'll support him regardless. That's how it's always been." Lina accepted this with the patience of someone who knew she wouldn't get more tonight. She dropped her bag by the door and went to wash up for dinner. Neither of them knew what was sleeping in the next room. They wouldn't for a while yet. Tomorrow the real work would begin. Chapter 9. SSS Grade Body Forging Method. Nova's eyes opened somewhere between 3 and 4 in the morning. He lay still for a moment, running his usual assessment. No discomfort. No residual exhaustion from the previous night's session. If anything, he felt better than he had yesterday morning, which was unexpected given that he had pushed absolute insight for over 6 hours straight and passed out fully clothed without eating lunch and dinner. He pulled up his panel to investigate. Spirit? 683. He looked at that number. It had been 670 before he had collapsed. 13 points of growth from a single extended session, and it wasn't from cultivation or a system reward, but from pushing his spirit capacity past its previous limit and holding it there until his body adapted. The quality of the energy had refined itself alongside the quantity, the way metal changes when you heat it properly. He filed that away with quiet satisfaction. Then his stomach made a sound that could generously be described as a formal complaint and less generously as a structural concern. He hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. His body had spent 6 hours running a divine tier comprehension talent at full capacity and had apparently decided that breakfast from 20 hours ago was no longer a reasonable substitute for actual nutrition. He got up, showered quickly, and headed downstairs. A covered plate sat on the dining table with a folded note propped against it in Aunt Myra's handwriting. "Microwave it. 2 minutes. Don't skip dinner." Apparently he already did. He microwaved it for 2 minutes. He sat down and finished it in considerably less time than that. When the plate was empty, he was functional but not satisfied, and his body's position on the matter, food, remained firm. He ignored it for now and pulled up the panel to look at what he'd built last night. Immortal Titan Foundation SSS Grade, Supreme Rank Body Forging Method, a supreme cultivation technique consisting of 31 sequential forms. Systematically purges impurities and tempers the physical vessel. Treats the body as a cosmic furnace and true chi as undying flame, refining each individual cell into an immortal particle. Cultivates body density to theoretical maximum. Ultimate achievement. Transform flesh into eternal diamond glass. Evolve the mortal frame into a self-contained chaotic universe. Transcend physical space, traverse galaxies with the body alone. Stars may shatter and dimensions collapse, but the cultivator endures eternally. Nova read it once, then again. I actually created an SSS-grade body forging method, he said to the empty kitchen. Saying it out loud did not make it feel more real. He tried once more. Still nothing. Cade had mentioned during a lecture that the most prestigious technique in the entire Valdres Federation was a breathing method named the Stellar Breath Technique, developed by a demigod-tier warrior after decades of dedicated research. SS grade. Considered one of the most advanced cultivation methods in recorded history. Only the highest-tier institutions and the wealthiest warrior bloodlines had access to it. Nova had been awake for 6 hours and had produced something 1 grade above that. He thought about the inputs, 100,000 times amplified comprehension, perfect mastery of 2 foundational techniques, and fragments of intents and principles from lives he couldn't fully remember yet, and concluded that the result was at least logically consistent with the ingredients, even if it remained difficult to emotionally process over breakfast. Only one way to find out if it works, he said, stood up, and moved to a clear section of the living room. The first form announced its difficulty immediately and without any diplomatic softening. The technique required him to push true chi past his meridians and down to the cellular level, establishing direct contact with individual cells and then vibrating them in precise coordinated patterns simultaneously. The frequency had to be exact. The coverage had to be total. The control required to maintain both conditions at once while also executing the physical form was something that absolute insight had given him complete theoretical understanding of and zero practical experience with. His first attempt scattered at the integration stage. Second attempt the same. Third attempt he held cellular contact for 2 seconds before the vibrational pattern collapsed. Attempts 4 through 8 produced progressively more coherent failures, which was encouraging in the way that consistently falling slightly less badly is encouraging. Attempt 9, 10, 11, 12. On the 13th attempt, something clicked. The true chi integrated. The vibrational pattern held across every cell simultaneously. The form began executing with the feedback loop running correctly for the first time, the technique doing exactly what it was designed to do. Then every nerve ending in his body filed simultaneous emergency reports. The pain was comprehensive. Invisible pressure from every direction. Something catastrophically wrong feeling happening in his bone marrow. His internal organs offering opinions he hadn't requested. Heat erupting from within his skin with enough intensity that wisps of steam rose from his arms in the cool morning air. He bit down and held the form. 10 seconds. When it concluded, his legs quietly stopped working and he sat down on the floor. He stayed there for 5 full minutes while his cardiovascular system held a committee meeting about what had just happened and gradually arrived at a consensus. "Dear God," he said to the floor with complete sincerity. When he could stand again, he looked at himself and stopped. He was covered in a thin layer of dark, faintly acrid residue. Impurities his body had discharged during the 10 seconds of cellular vibration, pushed out through his pores by the technique's purging function. Unpleasant. But beneath that, visible even through the mess, his body looked different. Leaner. Every muscle line cleaner and more defined than it had been when he woke up, as though the technique had quietly reorganized his physical structure toward greater efficiency in the 10 seconds it had been running. He went back upstairs and showered for the second time that morning. Standing at the mirror afterward, he looked at himself properly. The muscle distribution had changed. Not bulkier, more deliberate, each group placed and proportioned exactly where it needed to be for the kind of functional power his physique was being rebuilt around. His face had shifted slightly too, the features sharpening in a way that was subtle but visible to someone paying attention. He was fairly certain he was marginally taller than he'd been yesterday. He flexed one hand experimentally and felt the power that answered the movement. "So this is what SSS grade does," he said to his reflection. His reflection looked quietly pleased with the situation. He checked his panel before heading back downstairs. Strength, +10, speed, +10, agility, +10 10 seconds of the first form. More growth than a full month of his previous training had produced. He stared at those numbers for a moment and thought about all 31 forms, and what consistent practice across months would compound into, and had to make a conscious decision to stop doing that math because it was becoming difficult to stay calm about. His body's ongoing nutritional demands were becoming impossible to diplomatically ignore. He opened the delivery app on his watch and worked through the beast meat section with focused intent. Shadow feather chicken hot pot, large. Grilled thornboar ribs, triple order. Moonshadow rhino steak, extra rare. Silver scale fish platter. Order confirmed. Payment deducted. 3,902 points. Nova's eye twitched. He had never in his 17 years spent 3,902 points on a single meal. He had never spent 3,902 points on food in an entire month. Aunt Myra's grocery budget for a week was less than half that number. His father's salary transfer for supplements, sent with the warmth of someone sacrificing something real, would cover approximately 2 of these orders. He closed the app. He sat with that number for a moment and thought about what the Immortal Titan Foundation actually needed to run. True Chi. Not beast meat specifically, but the primordial Chi that beast meat carried in concentrated form, which his body converted into true Chi as fuel for the technique's cellular level demands. He had been absorbing ambient primordial Chi passively since his physique evolved, but passive absorption was a slow trickle against what the technique burned through in 10 seconds of the first form. He needed a Chi breathing and circulation technique. Not a purchased one, those were expensive, and the available commercial versions were designed for standard cultivation pathways, not for feeding a supreme rank body forging method. He needed one built specifically for his system, designed to pull primordial Chi from the ambient air at maximum efficiency and convert it to true Chi at a rate that could actually keep up with his requirements. And while he was building it, he might as well integrate it with the Immortal Titan Foundation rather than maintaining 2 separate practice sessions. One unified technique. Body refinement and Chi circulation running as a single system, each one fueling and enhancing the other. He added it to his mental task list, which was developing a distinct personality of its own at this point. Chapter 10 Food and Space Control. The money problem was connected to everything else on that list. A gravity chamber for high-resistance physical training. A holographic AI combat simulation system for technique refinement without a live partner. Resources he currently had no budget for and no obvious path to acquiring. He thought about that for approximately 3 seconds before the answer arrived, obvious once he looked at it directly. Knowledge was power, and power was also money. Specifically, rare and epic tier cultivation techniques and martial methods were things that warriors at Tier 4 through Tier 8 paid extraordinary sums to acquire, because at those levels the difference between a good technique and an exceptional one was measured in survival and advancement speed. He had absolute insight and the ability to create SSS-grade methods in a single focus session. He could produce techniques that the market would compete viciously over under an anonymous identity and solve the resource problem permanently. Later, though, his task list was already longer than he had hours in the day, and the food was arriving shortly. A few minutes later, he stepped onto the balcony. A young woman in a delivery uniform stood balanced on the exterior ledge 4 floors above street level with the relaxed ease of someone who found this completely unremarkable. Short auburn hair, bright straightforward smile, large insulated bag over one shoulder. Chronodash delivery, fastest in Thornhaven. Order 54656. That's me. She transferred the containers with efficient cheer. Taking the martial aptitude exam soon, right? All this beast meat smart prep. Name's Kira, don't forget the 5-star rating. She was already stepping back to the ledge edge. Got another order. See you. She jumped off a 4th-floor balcony, said accelerate, and left. Nova stood in the doorway with his containers and watched. And without any conscious decision, absolute insight activated behind his eyes. What he saw made him forget about the containers entirely. When Kira's talent activated, her souls and chi core had pulsed, spreading energy outward through her body in a wave that reached her skin and went further, extending into the space around her. And through the law etched into her soul, that energy had reached out and touched something in the fabric of the world that Nova had no previous framework for perceiving. Intense, universal, intense, ancient and vast, woven into the structure of reality itself. Speed, motion, air pressure, displacement. They existed in the world the way gravity existed, constant, fundamental, indifferent to whether anyone was paying attention to them. Kira's talent didn't give her control over these intents directly. It gave her an interface, a thread of connection through her etched intent that let her borrow their effect, summon a fraction of their principle into her movement. But absolute insight wasn't watching Kira anymore. It was allowing him to watch the intents themselves, laid bare in the air where her talent had called them forward, visible to his divine tier comprehension the way a page of text is visible to someone who has learned to read. Nova stood in the doorway and the world went quiet. Enlightenment, what every cultivator or warrior wished for, arrived without announcing itself, the way it apparently always did. Not as a dramatic event but as a door swinging open that he hadn't known was there. His mind reached into what he was seeing and began pulling threads. The sealed memories helped enormously. The 1% that had cleared during the trial surfaced now in a new context, its fragments of intense and partial laws and compressed cultivation experience from lives he couldn't remember suddenly finding the footholds they needed. What had arrived as disconnected shards began connecting to what his absolute insight was comprehending in real time, each piece of sealed memory meeting a piece of present observation and the two resolving together into something complete. The minor intents came first, arriving in rapid succession as his comprehension caught each one and pulled it to mastery. Speed, the fundamental principle of displacement across time. Motion, the deeper law beneath it, governing the relationship between objects and the space they moved through. Air pressure and displacement, the way matter responded to rapid movement through a medium. Oscillation, the principle he had already touched with the vibrational force technique, but now understood at a level that made his previous grasp look like someone who had learned to count being shown calculus. Then physics resolved itself wholesale into his comprehension. Force application at the quantum level, resonance mechanics, thermal generation through controlled vibration, wave propagation through different mediums. He had understood these intellectually before through absolute insight's recall of his previous life's education. Now he understood them as a cultivator understood a law, not as external knowledge but as something that had become part of how he perceived the world. The main elemental intents arrived next, each one vast and fundamental and distinct. Fire, transformation, consumption, renewal, the principle of one state becoming another through energy. Water, adaptation, persistence, the yielding strength of something that finds every available path. Earth, stability, density, the law of things that endure. Wood, growth, vitality, the principle of living systems reaching toward what they need. Metal, refinement, hardness, the law of things that become more themselves under pressure. Lightning, speed and violence combined, the intent of immediate and total discharge. Light, revelation, the principle of what cannot be hidden. Darkness, concealment, potential, the law of what exists unseen. Each one settled into his comprehension and rang at a frequency that suggested depth he hadn't touched the bottom of yet. Then the major intents. Space, and this one hit differently, vast and structural, the law governing the relationship between all locations and the distances between them. He felt his comprehension of it connect directly to what Kira's talent had shown him, the minor intents of speed and displacement feeding into the larger law like tributaries into a river. Gravity, the pull that shaped everything, the principle of mass and attraction that organized the universe at every scale. Life, the most complex of the three, not fully resolved but present, the law of what it meant for something to be alive and to persist. He had no idea how long he stood in the doorway. When the enlightenment cleared, he was still holding the delivery containers and his arms had gone slightly numb from the position. He set the containers on the balcony railing and flexed his hands and took stock. Most intents mastered to level 10, the peak level before breakthrough into laws. The sealed memories had supplied the remaining gaps, their fragments of cultivated intents from past lives slotting into his present comprehension and elevating it to the threshold. He was standing at the edge of multiple law breakthroughs simultaneously, each one waiting for the specific push that would carry it across. He had been standing in his doorway for what his internal clock suggested was 40 minutes. Then the system prompt appeared. New talent discovered. Etching process has begun. He felt it start immediately. The familiar gathering sensation in his soul, the presence of something preparing to be written permanently into his deepest self. This etching felt different from the previous ones. Not the simple warmth of emberwood flame or even the vast recursive patterns of unlimited amplification. This was sharp and multidimensional, branching rapidly across his soul in directions that seemed to follow the structure of the intents he had just comprehended, as though the talent being etched was itself a map of what he now understood. It was, as all the etchings had been, genuinely soothing. His soul strengthened perceptibly during the process, the increased density of comprehension settling into it like weight into a structure that had been built to hold more than it currently carried. His spirit value climbed as the etching completed, and some gray cleared. Not much, a fraction, but it cleared, and what began moving through the gap was immediate and pressurized. Fragmented memories surging forward with the specific urgency of things that had been waiting a long time for an opening. Nova clamped down on it instantly, applying his spirit to reinforce the internal wall with everything he had. He had not finished processing the last clearance. He was not going to let a second flood through on top of an undigested first one. The wall held, the memories pressing against it with patient force, and he held it until the pressure stabilized. Later, when he was ready, etching complete, new talent, advanced space control, S-rank, he looked at that for a moment. Kira's acceleration talent had been A-rank, a good talent, clearly well-developed, the product of a soul that had found a compatible law and built a functional interface to it. What he had now was built on peak-level intent comprehension across multiple connected principles, with sealed memory fragments from past lives adding depth that